Welcome to How to Paint a Kings of War skeleton. Here's your paint list. After priming black and then gray from above, I start base coating all the silver areas with gun. Now we're going to do the first step of dirtying up the silver areas using umber shade. Now we apply a watered down mix of Beastie Brown, and this kind of makes a rust that's not too old, not too new, but kind of right in the middle. And it's okay to let this pool up. Now for some newer rust, we put a little bit of fiery orange into the mix, and I dab it around in certain areas, let it dry and take a look, see how everything sits. And the final step of making everything dingy on the silver areas, we use black shade. Kind of just like the orange mix, is just dabbing it in certain areas, blending it with my finger and leaving it to pool in some areas. Kind of breaks up the uniformity of the armor. We're getting ready to do some edge highlighting, so remember to use the side of the brush when possible versus the tip. It's much easier. Alright, so using steel, we start to pick out the edges of the shield as well as some of the slashes that went across it, all the little dents and things. And then we'll actually start to pick out pieces of the armor by using stippling, which is basically, instead of you highlighting like we normally would, you would start to highlight by kind of making little dots with the brush. And here's where I start the stippling process. You want to do it with not really a wet brush, but kind of what you would dry brush with, and use a small brush to do this and just kind of pick out where the light's showing you the highlight would be. Now I base coat the cloth using heavy black green. For the first highlight, we add a little bit of jade to the heavy black green, and we start to hit all the surface area, leaving just the finest, deepest details in with the heavy black green. So hit everything else, but leave the details, that original color. Now we start with just jade green on the second highlight, and this is where you really want to look at the model and figure out where your highlights are going to be, because at this step, this is when it starts to matter. And then once you start to play around and find out exactly where you want your highlights, you know where the extreme highlights are going to be, which is the next step. So if you mess up, you don't like where a highlight's placed, this is the time to fix that before going on to the next step. Now in the last step, you figured out where you wanted your highlights to be. And so now this step isn't as scary. And you're using jade green mixed with dead white. And this is where this thing starts to pop and you start to realize whether your choices were good or not. And figuring out whether or not you have to kind of go back a couple steps. Now that the green's done, we'll go ahead and start base coating the leather bits. Once all the leather areas are dry, I take sepia shade and apply that liberally over those parts. Let it pull up a little bit. I didn't think the sepia shade was dark enough, so I came back with black shade and applied that. Now, you could say to yourself, well, we'll just skip the sepia shade and go to the black, but the color will be different because the sepia shade is still showing through the black. I don't know if that makes sense, but it matters. And now we take leather brown, bring it back up. So we apply leather brown, put washes to darken it and create our shadows basically, and then we clean it back up with the color we originally base coated with. I tend to do that a lot in my painting sessions on pretty much any item unless I need it to be clean. But if it's something like shoes or armor, stuff that should be pretty messy on most models, it's a good way to do it. Now we use a mix of leather brown and dead white. Now, whenever you're trying to figure out your colors and how like many highlights you're going to do, the step before is when you try to figure out when your highlights are. It's not the same on every one, but you have to figure out how high you're going to go. So this was the final highlight step, and before that, when I'm redoing the base coat, that's when you're trying to figure out exactly where you want your highlights. That's something that is good practice, so that keeps you from going back and forth, and depending on how many highlights and different colors you use, your blend's going to be nicer. But sometimes you don't want it to be nice. It needs to be a kind of rough blend. I don't know how to explain that. It's like some things you want really nicely blended, other things not so much. So now I start base coating the bone. I use heavy blue gray. When you're doing white, you kind of have to figure out what you want to do, and you think about what the overall color of the model is. So right now it's pretty warm. The turquoises, the orange and browns, really warm browns on the armor. The overall model is warm, so I wanted to go cool with the bone colors. So I started with blue tones. That's kind of determining what the feel of the model is. Now, if you wanted it to be all warm, you'd probably use like a khaki or just something that's more on the brown tinge instead of being blue. But that's pretty much the tricks of painting white. Is the way white is perceived is all about the colors you use underneath your final highlights. Now the first highlight I use on this is ice yellow mixed with the heavy blue gray. And you think yellow, isn't that warm? Well, not really. When you look at it, it's a very cool tone, and that's just looking at the colors. It's weird how a red can be cool, or I don't think orange can be, but I don't know. I'm not too in depth with my color theory. I just kind of look at it and think about how this color makes me feel, and I go with that. But see, you don't have to do that. Just follow what I'm doing. Judge it for yourself when you look at the model. Now, I'm not completely sure why I chose flesh tone shade. I just wanted something different than using the brown or the black. So I figured, hey, let's use flesh tone. Let's see how that looks. I don't think I've ever done that on bone before. So let's see how that looks. Once the wash is dry, we come back with the ice yellow heavy blue gray mix and start to re-highlight. And here you'll start to see me do that stippling thing where I just start to do dots, and it creates texture when you do that rather than just a smooth blend into an area. And it kind of comes from the paint style called pointillism, where you can look at something from very far away and it looks like a really nice picture, and as you get closer and closer and closer to the painting, you notice that the picture is made up of just nothing but dots of paint, and how, you know, dots of yellow and red right next to each other can create orange, because when you get far enough away, your eye can't pick out the two different colors, so they optically mix. And yeah, it's kind of like that, but in little scale. You can create texture just by doing dots instead of your smooth strokes. Okay, dead white. This is when you decide to pick out the brightest points of light, because there's nothing that's going to be brighter than white. So you don't want to go overboard. You just want to do little dots of light here and there. Okay, I wasn't liking the way the shield was looking, so kind of doing this thing that's like 2-brush blending. I take one brush, apply the wash, and then I have another brush where I'm kind of buffing the edge and making it so where it's not so such a hard line. And so you put the wash or the paint kind of where you want that paint to be, and then you feather the edge with another brush. And then me pulling it off of the desk off camera was me blow drying it, and I'm still blow drying it because it looks a lot darker. I buff it out, and then when it dries, it doesn't look as dark. So kind of a speedy way to figure out where you're at on the model and get those layers done. Alright, now we're taking terracotta, painting the sword handle and also the sword sheath on the back. And then we take scarlet and edge highlight. And then I take gold to paint the handguard, the bottom piece of the handle on these swords. Okay, time to blackline everything. Now, you can skip this step or try an oil wash, but if you've watched the last couple of videos, this has kind of been something I've enjoyed doing, because if you think your model looks good at this step, once you start to blackline all the details, it just pops. And I love it on every model so far that I've done, and it's kind of a step that I'm deciding needs to be there in my videos and on my finished models. I love the way it looks. And that's pretty much it. So thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next video.